This country shouldn't be where it is. This country shouldn't be in debt. There's no way. It is unjustifiable. I cannot, by the life in me, understand why we are where we are. I cannot. I refuse to embrace.
It didn't begin with a speech or a scandal. It began with silence and the diamonds that stopped moving. The global diamond trade froze. Trading floors in Antwerp, Tel Aviv, and Mumbai fell eerily quiet. Botswana, the world's second largest diamond producer, simply turned off the tap. No explanations. No apologies. This wasn't a glitch. It was a declaration. The era of unquestioned access to Africa's mineral wealth was over. The world's most powerful jewelers scrambled for answers, but Botswana's silence was a new language of power. The diamonds stayed in the ground, a potent symbol of reclaimed sovereignty. The power dynamic had shifted, and the world was forced to listen. Chaos erupted in the diamond markets. Prices soared, supply chains collapsed. De Beers, once the industry's puppet master, was powerless. Luxury brands watched their lifeblood vanish. Botswana's move exposed the fragility of a system built on African compliance. The ripple effects threatened millions of jobs, from Indian polishers to European traders. Was this a temporary standoff or a new era? No one knew. The uncertainty was Botswana's greatest weapon. Africa was no longer a passive supplier, but a force shaping its own destiny. The silence from Gaborone sent shockwaves worldwide. Antwerp's trading halls froze. The global supply chain, once thought unbreakable, crumbled. Botswana's decision didn't just block diamonds, it shattered the entire system. Indian polishers faced unemployment, luxury brands panicked, and prices skyrocketed. The industry's vulnerability was laid bare. Power lay not in buying, but in withholding. By simply saying no, Botswana exposed the illusion of Western control. The world's most glamorous industry was now hostage to a single nation's will. Botswana's move struck at the heart of global power. For a century, Western corporations set the rules. Now, an African nation was rewriting them. De Beers, once a monopoly, was sidelined. Its control was an illusion. The precedent was set. If Botswana could do this, so could others, with cobalt, uranium, oil. The era of cheap, unquestioned resource extraction was ending. Botswana's silence forced the world to see it as a strategic player, not a dependent nation. The old system's stability, built on inequality, was crumbling. To understand Botswana's defiance, look north, to Burkina Faso and Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré's bold moves to reclaim gold mines and expel foreign troops inspired a continent. He proved African nations could challenge the old order and survive. His actions sparked a wave of confidence. Economic liberation was possible. Botswana's leaders saw a blueprint for a new partnership, Africa in control. The era of quiet compliance was over. A new Pan-Africanism, built on action, was rising. Africa was ready to hold the keys to its own treasure chest. The shift, inspired by leaders like Traoré, represents a pretty profound psychological change across Africa. It's a move away from a mindset of dependency towards one of agency and strength. For generations, African leaders were told that challenging the established economic order would lead to isolation, sanctions, and economic collapse. This threat was, more often than not, enough to ensure compliance, keeping the continent's vast resources flowing outwards with minimal benefit returning. The new wave of leadership, however, sees the greater risk in inaction, in allowing another generation to pass while their nation's wealth is siphoned away. They're redefining power, not as something to be requested from the West, but as something to be asserted from within. This awakening is visible not just in Burkina Faso or Botswana, but in a growing number of resource-rich nations. In Niger, for example, the new government is reviewing uranium mining contracts that have enriched France for decades while leaving the country one of the poorest on earth. In Mali and Guinea, leaders are demanding a greater share of gold revenues and insisting on local processing to add value before export. This is not just a scattered series of isolated disputes. It's actually a coordinated, albeit informal movement. It's a continent-wide pattern of resource nationalism, driven by a new generation that is unapologetic about putting its people's interests first. The old colonial powers and multinational corporations are facing a united front they never anticipated. This newfound confidence is fueled by a changing geopolitical landscape. With the rise of China, Russia, and other global powers, African nations now have more options. They're no longer confined to dealing exclusively with their former colonial rulers or Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and World Bank. This diversification of partnerships gives them greater leverage. They can play competing interests against each other to secure better deals for their resources. The West's long-held monopoly on investment and influence in Africa is eroding, and with it, its ability to dictate terms. This strategic realignment is providing the political space for African leaders to make bold moves like Botswana's diamond halt. Ultimately, Traoré's ripple effect is about the restoration of dignity. It's a rejection of the narrative that Africa is a continent of problems to be solved by outsiders. Instead, it's being recast as a continent of solutions, a storehouse of the world's most critical resources, and a key player in the 21st century global economy. By taking control of their resources, these nations are not just fighting for money, they are fighting for respect. They are demanding to be seen as equals on the world stage. The silence from Botswana is therefore not an isolated act of defiance, but a single, powerful note in a much larger symphony of African awakening. The continent is no longer asking for permission to be powerful. The silence from Botswana is a direct assault on the boardrooms of the powerful. For more than a century, one name has been synonymous with diamonds: De Beers. This corporate empire was built on a simple, ruthless strategy: control the supply, control the price, and control the narrative. They convinced the world that a small, crystallized piece of carbon was the ultimate symbol of eternal love, all while locking African nations into agreements that siphoned away the vast majority of the wealth. Now the bedrock of that empire is trembling. De Beers, the architect of the modern diamond industry, finds itself on the outside looking in, a spectator to a game it no longer controls. The corporation that once brought governments to their knees is now pleading for information, its calls to Gaborone going unanswered. This is a crisis of identity for De Beers and other Western corporations that have built their fortunes on African resources. Their entire business model is predicated on access, unfettered, predictable, and cheap access. They positioned themselves as indispensable partners, bringing the capital and technical expertise that African nations supposedly lacked. But Botswana's move exposes this as a carefully constructed myth. The expertise can be hired, and the capital can be sourced elsewhere. The only truly indispensable element is the diamonds themselves, and those belong to Botswana. The power dynamic, which has been skewed in the West's favor for generations, is now being forcibly rebalanced. The master has discovered that the servant can simply walk away from the table. The panic is palpable in corporate headquarters from London to New York. Emergency meetings are convened. Risk analysts work through the night, modeling the financial impact of a prolonged supply disruption. The numbers are terrifying. A sustained halt could wipe billions off their market valuations, shatter investor confidence, and threaten the very existence of companies that have long been considered titans of industry. The loss of control is absolute. They have no leverage, no military to send, and no political pressure that can force an independent nation to sell its own property. They are learning a harsh lesson. The power they thought they held was never really theirs. It was merely borrowed from the nations whose land they mined. This moment forces a reckoning with a deeply uncomfortable truth. The wealth of these Western corporations is inextricably linked to a history of exploitation. The multi-billion-dollar diamond industry was built on the back of cheap African labor and lopsided contracts that treated sovereign nations like corporate subsidiaries. De Beers did not create the diamonds, it merely controlled their distribution. Now, the source is asserting its authority. Botswana's action is not just a commercial dispute, it is a historical correction. It is a signal that the era of easy extraction is over. The corporations that grew rich on Africa's resources are now facing the terrifying prospect of a world where Africa sets the price. The crisis of control extends far beyond De Beers. It infects the entire ecosystem of Western economic dominance. Governments in Brussels, London, and Washington are watching with growing alarm. For decades, they have operated under the comfortable illusion that they held ultimate sway over global supply chains. Their foreign policy was often designed to protect the interests of their multinational corporations, ensuring the steady flow of raw materials needed to power their industries and economies. Botswana's defiance shatters this illusion. It demonstrates that a determined African nation can disrupt this system with a single sovereign decision. The political leverage they thought they had has evaporated in the face of quiet, resolute action. This is a direct challenge to the neo-colonial framework that has defined global economics since the mid-20th century. While the era of direct colonial rule ended, it was replaced by a more subtle system of economic control, enforced through international financial institutions, unfair trade agreements, and the overwhelming power of multinational corporations. This system ensured that wealth continued to flow from the global south to the global north. Botswana's diamond halt is a fundamental crack in this structure. It proves that economic independence is not a distant dream, but an achievable reality. If Botswana succeeds, it creates a dangerous precedent for the old powers. Other nations might be inspired to follow. The established powers are losing their most effective weapon, fear. For generations, the threat of economic isolation or political destabilization was enough to keep resource-rich nations in line. Any leader who dared to challenge the system was often met with covert action or crippling sanctions. But the world has changed. The rise of alternative economic powers in Asia and the Middle East means that African nations are no longer dependent on Western markets alone. This new multipolar world gives them options, and with those options, courage. The fear of being cut off by the West is replaced by the confidence that new partners will be eager to step in, often with more attractive terms. The true loss of control is therefore narrative control. The story that the West told itself and the world was one of benevolent partnership, of bringing progress and development to a struggling continent. Botswana's move reframes this narrative into one of exploitation and imbalance. It exposes the so-called partnership as a relationship where one side held all the power and reaped most of the rewards. By shutting off the supply of diamonds, Botswana has seized control of the story. It is no longer a passive subject in a tale written by others, but the active author of its own destiny. The old empires of wealth and influence are losing control because the very foundation of their power, the story they told, has been revealed as a lie. Behind the closed doors in Gaborone, this was not a rash decision. It was a calculated gambit, the result of years of mounting frustration and meticulous planning. Botswana's leadership, led by President Mokgweetsi Masisi, had been locked in tense, protracted negotiations with De Beers for a new sales agreement. The old deal, which gave Botswana a mere fraction of the value of its own diamonds, was a relic of a bygone era. The government's political calculus was sharp and clear. Continuing with the status quo was no longer politically tenable. The people of Botswana were increasingly aware of the vast wealth being extracted from their land and were demanding a greater share. This move was, therefore, first and foremost, a response to domestic pressure and a fulfillment of a promise to secure a better future for the nation. The strategy involved more than just tough negotiation. It required a deep understanding of the global market and De Beers' vulnerabilities. Botswana's strategists knew that the diamond giant's entire corporate identity was interwoven with its partnership with their country. By threatening to walk away, Botswana was not just threatening a revenue stream, it was threatening the very legitimacy of the De Beers brand. This political calculus also weighed the short-term economic pain of a production halt against the long-term gain of a fundamentally restructured deal. They wagered that the country's healthy foreign reserves and stable governance could withstand the temporary shock, while the global diamond industry could not survive without its most reliable source of high-quality gems. It was a high-stakes poker game, and Botswana had just pushed all its chips to the center of the table. Furthermore, the strategy was underpinned by a quiet, yet powerful sense of regional solidarity. While there were no formal public declarations of support, the diplomatic channels across southern and West Africa were buzzing. Leaders from neighboring countries, facing similar struggles with multinational resource companies, were watching Botswana's move with vested interest. This was not just Botswana's fight. It was a test case for the entire continent. A victory for Botswana would set a new benchmark for all future resource negotiations in Africa. This unspoken alliance provided a crucial psychological and political buffer, making it harder for Western powers to isolate and pressure Gaborone without appearing to be bullies attacking a continent-wide aspiration for economic justice. The calculus also included a forward-looking vision for the nation's economy. The ultimate goal was not just to get a better price for rough diamonds, but to move up the value chain. For decades, Botswana has mined the stones, only to see the most profitable activities, cutting, polishing, marketing, and retail, happen elsewhere. The government's hidden motive behind the halt was to force the creation of a vibrant diamond industry within Botswana itself. By controlling the supply, they could dictate that a larger portion of the stones be processed locally, creating thousands of skilled jobs and capturing a much larger piece of the final price of a finished diamond. This was not just about renegotiating a contract, it was about transforming an entire economy from a raw material exporter into a finished goods powerhouse. The most brilliant component of Botswana's strategy was its use of silence. In a world saturated with constant communication, press releases, and social media updates, the government's decision to say nothing was its most potent weapon. This calculated silence created a vacuum of information that was quickly filled with fear, speculation, and panic among the global diamond elite. It denied them a target to attack or a statement to dissect. De Beers and other industry players were left shadowboxing, unable to craft a coherent response because they had no official position to respond to. The silence was a masterclass in psychological warfare, amplifying the uncertainty and forcing their opponents to imagine the worst-case scenarios, which in turn put immense pressure on them to concede. This strategy of silence was also designed to seize control of the narrative on a global scale. By refusing to engage with Western media outlets, which have historically framed African resource disputes in a neo-colonial light, Botswana prevented its move from being portrayed as the act of an irresponsible or radical government. The absence of an official explanation forced observers to look at the facts, a long-standing, inequitable relationship and a nation simply withholding its own property. The silence allowed the action to speak for itself, and its message was one of strength, sovereignty, and quiet determination. It was a refusal to play the game by the old rules, where African leaders were expected to justify their actions to their former colonial masters. Behind this silence lay a web of hidden motives and carefully laid plans. While the world focused on the halt, Botswana was likely exploring alternative partnerships and distribution channels. The strategy was not simply to stop the flow, but to redirect it on their own terms. Government envoys would have been discreetly engaging with potential new buyers in emerging markets like India, the UAE, and China, nations that would be less concerned with upholding the old Western-dominated order. This creates a credible threat that if De Beers does not offer a vastly improved deal, Botswana is fully prepared to create a new, parallel diamond market that bypasses the traditional centers of power in Antwerp and London altogether. Ultimately, the calculated silence is a reflection of a new confidence. It is the posture of a nation that knows the value of what it holds and is no longer afraid to exercise its leverage. The political calculus determined that the risks of this bold action were outweighed by the potential rewards. The strategy was not just to win a better deal, but to fundamentally alter the nation's relationship with the rest of the world. It was a declaration that Botswana would no longer be a junior partner in its own enrichment. The silence from Gaborone was not an absence of a position, it was the clearest and most powerful position of all, communicating that the terms of the conversation had irrevocably changed. In an age of instant news and around-the-clock media cycles, the biggest stories are often not the ones being told, but the ones being ignored. The seismic shock of Botswana's diamond halt, a move with the power to upend a multi-billion-dollar global industry and redefine geopolitical power, was met with a perplexing and honestly conspicuous silence from the world's major news networks. While headlines were dominated by minor political scandals and, celebrity gossip, the story of an African nation taking a stand for its economic sovereignty was conspicuously absent. This was not a simple oversight. It was a calculated media blackout, a deliberate decision by the gatekeepers of global information to downplay, dismiss, and ultimately bury a story that challenged the comfortable status quo of Western economic dominance. The few reports that did emerge were framed to minimize the significance of Botswana's action. They were relegated to the business sections, presented as minor contractual disputes or technical glitches in the supply chain. The language used was carefully chosen to strip the story of its revolutionary context. Words like disagreement, hiccup, and standoff were used to describe what was, in reality, a declaration of economic independence. There was no mention of the colonial history, no discussion of the inequitable deals that have defined the resource trade for a century, and certainly no exploration of the continent-wide awakening that this move represents. The narrative was carefully managed to prevent audiences from seeing the bigger picture, a foundational crack appearing in the neo-colonial world order. This media strategy serves a clear purpose: to protect powerful corporate and national interests. An honest telling of the Botswana story would force uncomfortable questions upon Western audiences. It would make them question the true cost of the luxury goods they purchase and the exploitative systems that bring them to their stores. It would highlight the hypocrisy of championing freedom and sovereignty while simultaneously benefiting from economic structures that deny it to others. By refusing to give the story prominence, the media protects its corporate advertisers, from luxury jewelry brands to the financial institutions that bankroll them. The silence is not a failure of journalism, it is a successful defense of a profitable system that thrives on public ignorance. The blackout also aims to isolate Botswana and discourage other nations from following its lead. By treating the diamond halt as a non-event, the global media sends a powerful, unspoken message to other African leaders: your acts of defiance will be ignored. Your struggles for economic justice will not be televised. This is a potent form of psychological warfare designed to make these nations feel small and insignificant on the world stage, fostering a sense of hopelessness that their actions cannot possibly change the global power structure. The story wasn't told because telling it would have given a voice to the powerless and legitimacy to a rebellion that the established order cannot afford to see succeed. The media blackout is more than just an absence of coverage. It is an active tool for manufacturing consent. By ignoring Botswana's bold move, the media normalizes the existing exploitative relationship. It creates a reality where the flow of Africa's wealth to the West is presented as the natural, unchangeable state of affairs. This silence is a form of propaganda, far more subtle and more effective than overt state-controlled media. It doesn't need to lie about the story. It simply ensures the story is never heard in the first place. This allows the citizens of Western nations to continue their lives untroubled by the moral complexities of the global economy, their consent manufactured not by what they are told, but by what they are not. The dismissal of the story, when it is briefly mentioned, is a key part of this strategy. Financial news outlets frame it as a risky, ill-advised move by a small African nation jeopardizing its own stability. Analysts are brought on air to warn of capital flight and economic collapse, painting the government of Botswana as reckless and incompetent. This narrative serves to delegitimize the act of sovereignty itself, portraying it as irrational self-harm. It reinforces a paternalistic, colonial-era mindset that African nations are incapable of managing their own affairs and need the steady hand of Western corporations to guide them. The subtext is clear: challenging the system is not brave, it is foolish. This deliberate downplaying stands in stark contrast to the media's treatment of other resource-related news. When a Western nation faces a minor disruption to its energy supply, it becomes a headline crisis, sparking fears of economic recession and demanding immediate action. Yet, when an African nation makes a move that could uplift its entire population for generations, it is considered a niche business story. This double standard reveals the inherent bias in the global media landscape. Stories are deemed important only in relation to their impact on Western interests. The economic liberation of an entire continent is not as newsworthy as a slight increase in fuel prices in Europe or America. Ultimately, the media blackout is a testament to the power of Botswana's strategy. It is an admission of fear. The established powers and their media allies are silent because they have no good answer to the questions this story raises. They cannot defend the indefensible, so they choose to ignore it instead. They hope that by refusing to acknowledge the rebellion, it will simply fade away. But the silence from the media cannot overcome the silence from the mines. The diamonds are still in the ground, and the world is slowly being forced to listen, not to the news anchors, but to the powerful, resonant silence emanating from Gaborone, a silence that speaks louder than any headline ever could. To truly understand Botswana's defiant stand, we must peel back the layers of time. We must look beyond the gleaming showrooms and corporate logos, back to the very beginning of Africa's diamond story. This story is not one of partnership or fair trade. It is a brutal legacy of extraction, written in the blood and sweat of the African people. It began in the late 19th century, not in Botswana, but in the Belgian Congo, under the merciless rule of King Leopold II. There, the quest for rubber and ivory, and later diamonds, unleashed a reign of terror that saw millions perish. The wealth flowed to Brussels, building grand monuments, while the land it came from was systematically broken and bled dry. This was the blueprint for resource acquisition in Africa. This model of exploitation was perfected and industrialized by men like Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist who founded De Beers. His vision was not just to mine diamonds, but to control an entire continent. The discovery of diamonds in South Africa, near Kimberley, did not bring prosperity to the region's inhabitants. Instead, it brought dispossession, forced labor, and the entrenchment of a racist system that would later become apartheid. African men were forced from their lands and driven into deep, dangerous mines to extract the stones that would make European investors fabulously wealthy. This was not business. It was conquest disguised as commerce, a system designed to funnel Africa's subterranean treasures into the coffers of a colonial empire, leaving poverty in its wake. The pattern was repeated across the continent, from the fields of Sierra Leone to the riverbeds of Angola. The discovery of diamonds was rarely a blessing for the local population. It was often a curse that brought conflict, corruption, and foreign domination. The colonial powers drew arbitrary lines on maps, creating nations but ensuring the economic structures remained tilted in their favor. When independence came in the mid-20th century, the political chains were broken, but the economic shackles remained firmly in place. Newly independent nations, including Botswana upon its discovery of diamonds in 1967, were forced to negotiate with powerful established corporations like De Beers from a position of profound weakness, locking them into deals that perpetuated the colonial era imbalance. Botswana's story was seen as an exception, a miracle of good governance and prudent resource management. But even this miracle was built on a compromise that is now being seen as unacceptable. The nation avoided the worst of the resource curse, but it still surrendered a vast portion of its wealth and control to a foreign corporation. The decision to halt diamond exports is therefore not just a contemporary political move. It is a deep, resonant echo of a long and painful history. It is a delayed but determined attempt to finally break the chains of a legacy of extraction and reclaim a destiny that was stolen over a century ago. It is Africa finally demanding to be the master of its own house. The global diamond industry was built on a carefully constructed illusion. The price of a diamond has very little to do with its scarcity. De Beers ensured that by stockpiling stones to control supply. Instead, its value was manufactured through brilliant marketing. The slogan, "A diamond is forever," created a powerful emotional connection, transforming a mineral into a non-negotiable symbol of love and commitment. But, beneath this polished veneer of romance lies a much darker truth about the real price of a diamond. That price has been paid for generations, not in dollars or euros, but in the lost potential, stunted development, and exploited labor of the African continent. The true cost was obscured from the final consumer. For every diamond that sparkles in a ring, there is a story of a lopsided negotiation. Western corporations arrived with teams of lawyers, geologists, and economists, facing newly formed African governments that often lacked the capacity and expertise to negotiate on equal footing. The contracts that were signed reflected this power imbalance. They guaranteed low royalties, minimal tax obligations, and almost no commitment to local development or value addition. The most profitable parts of the industry, the cutting, polishing, marketing, and retail, were deliberately kept outside of Africa. So, the continent was relegated to the role of a simple digger, doing the hardest work for the smallest share of the reward. That has been the price. This economic model created a deep and lasting dependency. African nations became reliant on the revenue, however small, from these single commodities, leaving their economies vulnerable to global price swings and corporate whims. It stifled diversification and innovation, trapping them in a cycle of primary resource exportation. The real price of a diamond was the opportunity cost. The schools that were never built, the hospitals that were never funded, the industries that never had a chance to grow. It was the price of a future postponed, a continental potential held in check to ensure the stability and profitability of Western markets and luxury brands. This is the historical injustice that Botswana is now confronting. Botswana's move to halt exports is an attempt to finally calculate the true price of its diamonds and demand that it be paid, not to De Beers, but to the people of Botswana. It is a declaration that the value of their resource is not just its market price, but its potential to transform their society. By taking control, they are challenging the entire historical architecture of the trade. They are insisting that the price of a diamond must now include the cost of their children's education, their nation's infrastructure, and their people's dignity. The world is being forced to reckon with the fact that for a century, it has been getting its diamonds at a steep, unconscionable discount, a discount paid for by Africa itself. Botswana's audacious move is not an isolated event. It's, the most visible crest of a powerful wave building across the African continent. But let's be clear, this is not just about diamonds. From the gold-rich fields of West Africa to the oil-producing nations of the Atlantic coast, a clear and undeniable pattern is emerging. The era of passive compliance is, over. African nations are systematically moving to reclaim ownership of the natural resources that form the bedrock of their national wealth. They are rewriting the rules of engagement, one commodity at a time. The silence from Gaborone is part of a much larger, continental conversation, a coordinated, if informal pushback against a century of economic subjugation. The world is being forced to recognize that a fundamental shift is underway, a great reclaiming of sovereignty. Look to the Sahel, where this new assertiveness is most pronounced. In Niger, home to some of the world's highest-grade uranium ore, the government is challenging decades-old mining deals with France that have powered French nuclear reactors while leaving Niger in darkness and poverty. In neighboring Mali, the military government is demanding a larger stake in its gold mines, long dominated by Canadian and British firms, and insisting on audits to verify that the country is receiving its fair share. These are not mere contractual disputes, they are fundamental challenges to a neo-colonial economic model. They represent nations waking up to the absurdity of being resource-rich yet cash-poor, and deciding to do something about it. The pattern extends beyond mineral resources. In the energy sector, nations like Nigeria and Angola are pushing for greater local content requirements, demanding that international oil companies invest in local infrastructure, train local engineers, and partner with indigenous firms. They are no longer content to simply watch crude oil being pumped from their shores, only to be sold back to them as expensive refined fuels. They are demanding a piece of the entire value chain, from extraction to refining and distribution. This is a strategic, continent-wide effort to end the extractive model and build diversified, resilient economies based on the value addition to their own raw materials. The great resource giveaway is finally coming to an end. What connects these disparate actions, from uranium in Niamey to diamonds in Gaborone, is a shared realization of leverage. For decades, African nations negotiated from a perceived position of weakness. Today, they understand that in a resource-hungry world, they hold the ultimate trump card control over the supply. They have watched how cartels like OPEC have successfully managed oil prices, and they are now applying those lessons to their own precious commodities. This is not a formal alliance, but a shared consciousness, a strategic convergence. The message being sent from multiple African capitals is identical. The days of taking our wealth on your terms are over. A new era is beginning. This emerging pattern represents nothing less than the second stage of African liberation. The first wave, in the mid-20th century, brought political independence, granting nations flags, anthems, and seats at the United Nations. However, it left the colonial economic structures largely intact. The great reclaiming we are witnessing today is the fight for the second, more difficult, and arguably more important form of independence, economic sovereignty. It is the long-delayed fulfillment of the promise of decolonization. African leaders are now asserting that political freedom is meaningless without control over the economic destiny of their nations. This is the final, decisive battle against the legacy of colonial exploitation. The strategy behind this reclaiming is becoming clearer. It involves a multi-pronged approach. First, there is the renegotiation or outright cancellation of old, inequitable contracts. Second, there is the demand for greater transparency in the resource sector to combat corruption and ensure accurate accounting of what is being extracted. Third, there is the push for local processing and value addition to capture more of the wealth within Africa. And finally, as Botswana has demonstrated so powerfully, there is the willingness to use the ultimate weapon withholding supply to force the world to the negotiating table on new, equitable terms. This is a sophisticated and coordinated strategy for economic empowerment. This movement is forcing multinational corporations and the Western governments that back them into an uncomfortable corner. Their business models, which rely on cheap, easy access to African resources, are now under existential threat. They are faced with a choice: either adapt to this new reality and accept a more balanced and fair partnership, or risk being shut out of the world's richest continent entirely. For corporations that have built their empires on the old model, this is a terrifying prospect. The Great Reclaiming is not just shifting profits, it is shifting the very balance of global power, moving the center of gravity away from corporate boardrooms in London and Paris and towards presidential palaces in Gaborone and Niamey. This is a story of profound hope and self-determination. It is Africa rising, not on the back of foreign aid or charity, but through the strength of its own resources and the courage of its own people. The pattern is undeniable and the momentum is growing. Gold, uranium, oil, and now diamonds, stone by stone, barrel by barrel, the continent is taking back what is rightfully its own. The world is watching a slow-motion revolution, a quiet but firm declaration that Africa will no longer be the world's mine, but its own master. This is the Great Reclaiming, and it is reshaping our world before our very eyes. Imagine a different future for Africa, one not defined by aid, debt, or dependency. This is the future that Africa's new economics could build. If Botswana's move is the blueprint, the potential impact is, honestly, staggering. With full control over its diamond exports, the nation's wealth would no longer be a stream trickling back in the form of royalties, but a river flowing directly into its own treasury. This is not just about more money, it's about sovereign money, untethered from the conditions of foreign lenders or the profit motives of multinational corporations. It is capital that can be deployed strategically to build the continent's future on its own terms, funding the schools, hospitals, and high-speed railways that will serve generations of Africans. This is the ultimate prize, the power to self-fund a continental renaissance. This new economic model goes far beyond simply selling raw materials for a higher price. The true transformation comes from capturing the entire value chain. By controlling the supply of rough diamonds, Botswana can mandate that a significant portion be cut, polished, and set into jewelry within its own borders. This single policy shift would create a cascade of economic benefits. It would spawn new industries, foster technological innovation, and create thousands of high-skilled, well-paying jobs for gemologists, artisans, and marketers. The label Made in Botswana would become a symbol not just of origin, but of quality and economic justice, turning a former raw material exporter into a global hub for luxury goods. This is the path from extraction to industrialization. Extrapolate this model across the continent. Imagine a world where Congolese cobalt is not just mined, but is used to manufacture batteries in Kinshasa. Picture Nigerian oil being refined into fuel and petrochemicals in Port Harcourt, powering local industries instead of foreign economies. Envision Ghanaian cocoa being transformed into world-class chocolate in Accra. This is the core of Africa's new economics, a radical shift from exporting low-value raw materials to producing high-value finished goods. It's a strategy to break the economic shackles of colonialism and finally allow Africa to harness its immense resource wealth for the primary benefit of its own people, creating a powerful, self-sustaining internal market. The geopolitical consequences of this economic shift would be profound. A financially independent Africa, powered by its own industries, would be a new superpower on the world stage. It would no longer need to seek validation or approval from Western capitals. Its leaders would negotiate as equals, their voices carrying the weight of genuine economic might. This would fundamentally rebalance the global order, creating a more multipolar and equitable world. The new economics being forged today in places like Gaborone is not just about rewriting contracts. It is about rewriting Africa's place in the world, transforming it from a continent of potential into a continent of power. The silence from the diamond mines of Botswana has echoed across the globe, revealing a profound and irreversible shift in the world order. This was never just about a contract dispute or the price of precious stones. It was about a fundamental question that challenges a century of established power dynamics. What if Africa never needed to ask for power, but only to stop giving it away? The decision in Gaborone was the answer. It was a demonstration that the continent's greatest strength lies not in its negotiations with the powerful, but in its control over what the powerful need. The wealth, the leverage, and the future have always been buried in African soil. All that has changed is the will to claim it. This is the new reality. The pattern is now clear and the momentum is building. From the gold of Mali, the uranium of Niger, to the diamonds of Botswana, a new consciousness is dawning. It is a realization that the keys to the continent's prosperity were never lost. They were simply handed over. Now, Africa is taking them back. This is not a rebellion based on ideology or rhetoric, but on the simple, pragmatic act of taking control of one's own property. The world is being forced to relearn a basic lesson of economics. The ultimate power belongs not to the buyer, but to the owner of the essential goods. The corporations and nations that built their wealth on easy access to Africa's resources are now facing a future where that access is no longer guaranteed, but must be earned on equitable terms. This is a story that is still being written, not in the boardrooms of London or New York, but in the sovereign capitals of a rising continent. The outcome is not yet certain, but the direction of travel is undeniable. The old model of extraction and exploitation is dying, and in its place, a new economics of self-determination is being born. The world must now choose how it will respond, with resistance to the inevitable, or with a new respect for a partnership of equals. The silence from Botswana was the opening move in this new great game, a quiet declaration that the continent will no longer be a passive provider, but an active architect of its own destiny, and by extension, the world's future. One stone at a time, Africa is rewriting its story. Not in boardrooms, but in bold decisions. This is Insight Africa, where silence signals strength, and the continent answers with power.